Today we're diving into a pretty brutal fact of business life. Most companies just don't last. And you want to know why? Because the world never ever stops changing. In business, if you're not changing right along with it, you're not just falling behind, you're basically on the road to extinction. So let's talk about the one thing that separates the survivors from the fossils: innovation.
So let's kick things off with a little thought experiment. A huge study looked at over 6 million companies and found something pretty staggering. Almost no large companies actually make it to their 40th birthday. Just think about that for a second. Why do so many of these giants fall?
Well, the answer is simple, and honestly, it's stark. If organizations don't innovate, they die. Period. The companies that survive, they're not just okay with change, they are absolutely ruthless about pursuing it. But what does that actually look like day to day?
This brings us right to our first big idea: the innovation imperative. In today's world, you are either the one causing the disruption or you are the one being disrupted. There's really no safe middle ground anymore.
And the force that's driving all this constant upheaval? It's called disruptive innovation. These are the real game changers. They don't just offer a slightly better mousetrap. Nah, they start out small, on the fringes, often totally overlooked, and then they completely rewrite the rules for an entire industry, leaving all the old leaders just scratching their heads, wondering what in the world just happened. I mean, the classic example, of course, is Netflix versus Blockbuster. It's kind of funny to remember that Netflix started as this quirky little service mailing DVDs in red envelopes. Blockbuster, the absolute giant in the room, they barely even noticed. But what Netflix was really selling was a whole new level of convenience, a new model that eventually made the entire idea of a physical video store totally obsolete.
And you know, we saw this exact same pattern with cameras. For decades, companies were just fighting over megapixels and bigger zoom lenses. Then the smartphone shows up. Now, it wasn't the best camera, not by a long shot, but it was the one that was always in your pocket. And crucially, it was connected to the internet. That combination of convenience and integration completely swallowed a whole standalone industry.
And more recently, look at what companies like Uber and Lyft did to the taxi industry, a service that had worked the exact same way for like a century. They didn't invent a better car, they just used technology to fundamentally change how we call, pay for, and even think about getting a ride. So how do you possibly stay ahead of this tidal wave? Well, this quote from Jeff Bezos really gets to the heart of the mindset you need. He's not just saying it's okay to fail. He's saying that if you're a massive company and you aren't having these huge, multi-billion-dollar failures every once in a while, it actually means you're not swinging for the fences hard enough. Failure is just a data point on the way to finding the next big thing.
Okay, so you have to be willing to experiment and fail. Got it. But how do you do that while also running the profitable, stable business that you have today? This leads us to a really fascinating concept: the ambidextrous engine. The secret is what some people call the ambidextrous approach. And it's pretty much what it sounds like. Think about being able to write with both your left and right hand equally well. A company needs one hand for that wild, creative, messy spark of new ideas, and it needs the other for the disciplined, systematic, focused process of actually bringing those ideas to life. So it really boils down to mastering two opposing forces at the same time. On one side, you've got exploration. This is the playground. It's all about creativity, taking risks, experimenting, and dreaming up what's next. Then, on the other side, you have exploitation. This is the factory floor. It's about efficiency, precision, routines, and just perfectly executing on what you already do well. Most companies are good at one of these. The truly great ones, they master the tricky, constant balancing act between both.
All right, so let's say you've built the structure to handle innovation. But where do the actual ideas come from? Well, as it turns out, the best answer is everywhere.
This simple phrase says it all, really. That old stereotype of the lone genius having a eureka moment in a lab, it's mostly a myth. Real modern innovation requires deep collaboration across an entire organization.
So one way you can actually structure this is called the horizontal linkage model. It's all about smashing down those silos between departments. Research can't just invent something cool and toss it over the wall to the next team. No way. They need to be talking to marketing from day one to even understand what customers want. And both of them need to be talking to manufacturing to figure out if the idea is even possible to build at a decent price. It's got to be this constant circular conversation. But the smartest companies today realize something huge. Not all the smart people in the world work for them. And this leads to this idea of open innovation. Basically, the idea of looking for solutions outside your own company walls, whether that's from customers, universities, partners, or even just the general public.
And this quote just hits the nail on the head. It's not an either-or choice between looking inside or outside for ideas. The real magic happens at the intersection, when you can combine the deep knowledge you have inside your company with all the fresh, diverse perspectives you can find in the outside world.
And here's just a fantastic, kind of a weird example. Procter & Gamble wanted to print jokes on Pringles chips. So instead of trying to invent that technology from scratch, they looked outside. And they found a small bakery in Italy that had already figured out how to print edible images on cakes. How brilliant is that? That's open innovation in a nutshell. Now, an idea, I don't care how brilliant it is completely powerless on its own. It needs a human engine. And that person is the idea champion. This is the one who believes in the idea when nobody else does. The one who fights for the budget, who navigates all the internal politics, and who just flat out refuses to let the idea die.
And really, don't underestimate how vital this role is. Research from companies like Texas Instruments came to this incredibly clear conclusion. Every single successful new product they had a passionate champion behind it. And every single one that failed lacked one. No champion, no product. It is that black and white.
But even with a brilliant idea and a passionate champion, you're going to hit the final and often the highest hurdle: people. Why is it so hard to actually implement change? Well, because on a really fundamental level, we humans are kind of wired to resist it. Let's dig into why that is.
The reasons are just deeply human. People aren't just being difficult. They're worried about their own self-interest, right? They're thinking, is this change going to make my job obsolete? They have a lack of trust if they don't get the real reasons behind the change. The sheer uncertainty of what the future looks like is super stressful. And sometimes they just have different goals. They might genuinely believe, and they might even be right, that the change is a terrible idea for the company.
So, if you know resistance is coming, how do you manage it? How do you actually make a change stick? Well, thankfully, you don't have to guess. There's a proven roadmap for this stuff.
It's called Lewin's change model. And you can think of it like changing the shape of an ice cube. First, you have to unfreeze. You melt the ice. This means you have to make people aware of why the old way isn't working anymore and really create the motivation to change. Second, you enter the changing phase. That's when it's all water. This is when people experiment with new ways of doing things and learn new skills. And then finally, you refreeze. You lock that water into its new shape. You reinforce the new behaviors until they just become the new normal.
And that brings us right back around to the beginning. We've seen that innovation is literally a matter of survival. It needs a special kind of structure that can handle both wild creativity and disciplined execution. And it needs a culture that looks for ideas everywhere. But most of all, it all comes down to people, overcoming our natural resistance to change and finding those individuals who will carry an idea forward against all odds. Because in the end, a single idea backed by a true champion really can change everything. The only question is, who's going to champion the next one?